On June 28, 1914, a single bullet tore through the neck of an archduke. It was fired from a cheap Belgian-made pistol in a city few could find on a map. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand bled to death in his car within minutes. His wife Sophie died beside him. The gunman, a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip, was immediately seized. To the policemen on the scene, it was a local tragedy, a political murder in a restless province. They could not have known they were holding the man who had just unlocked the gates to a global nightmare. That one piece of lead weighing less than an ounce would set in motion a chain of events so vast it defies imagination. It would summon armies numbering in the tens of millions. It would redraw the map of continents and topple ancient empires. It would invent new forms of horror in muddy trenches and poison gas clouds. And when the guns finally fell silent, it would leave behind a world so shattered, so vengeful and so unstable that an even greater catastrophe became inevitable. This is the story of that shot. It is the story of how a single violent act in a Sarajevo street did not just claim 2 lives. It changed the life of everyone born after it. It designed the terrifying modern world we live in today. The continent was a powder keg, and Sarajevo was the fuse. On the morning of June 28, 1914, the air in the Bosnian city was thick with more than summer heat. It was charged with nationalist anger. Bosnia-Herzegovina had been annexed by Austria-Hungary just 6 years prior. To many Slavic nationalists, this was an occupation. To the visiting Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, it was a routine inspection tour. His procession was planned as a show of imperial strength, open-top cars, polished uniforms, a route through the city's wide avenues. But the security was shockingly lax for a man whose very existence was a provocation. Local police were few, soldiers were kept back, the Archduke himself had dismissed concerns. He wanted to be seen. Beside him in the car sat his wife Sophie. Their marriage, once a scandal, was now a quiet source of his happiness. She was rarely allowed to appear beside him at formal events in Vienna. Here in Sarajevo they rode together. It was a small personal victory on a day of immense public risk. The motorcade moved slowly, a perfect target. Lining the Appel Quay were crowds of onlookers. Among them, hidden in plain sight, were 7 young men. They were armed with pistols and bombs. They were prepared to die. They believed one act of violence could shatter an empire and free their people. The stage was set, the players were in place. All it required was a single moment of contact. The stage was Sarajevo, a city at the very edge of an empire. For the young men waiting along the Appel Quay that morning, Austria-Hungary was not a homeland. It was an occupying force. Bosnia and Herzegovina had been annexed by Vienna just 6 years earlier, in 1908. A move that sent shockwaves through the Balkans. In Belgrade, the capital of the independent Kingdom of Serbia, nationalist groups burned with a fierce idea. A unified South Slav state, a Yugoslavia, free from Habsburg control. One of the most radical was the Black Hand, a secret society of military officers and revolutionaries. They saw Archduke Franz Ferdinand not as a man, but as a symbol. His planned reforms to grant more autonomy to the Slavic peoples within the empire were, to them, a threat. Greater rights might placate the population and undermine the dream of total independence. His visit to Sarajevo on a state holiday, Vidovdan, was a profound insult. This day commemorated the Serbian defeat at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a sacred date of national martyrdom. His presence felt like a parade of imperial power on hallowed ground. The Black Hands saw an opportunity. They recruited 6 young Bosnian Serbs, armed them with pistols and bombs, and sent them across the border. Their mission was simple and catastrophic: remove the heir and shatter the empire's confidence. The fuse was lit and the motorcade was rolling straight toward it. But the plan had already failed. The morning motorcade passed by. Nedeljko Chabranovic threw his bomb. It bounced off the car. It detonated under the next vehicle. Ferdinand was unharmed. The shaken Archduke continued to the town hall. He delivered a furious impromptu speech. He then insisted on visiting the wounded from the blast at the hospital. His driver took a wrong turn. The car stalled. It reversed slowly. It came to a stop directly in front of a small delicatessen. A young man stood there dejected. He had abandoned his post after the bomb failed. He was buying a sandwich. His name was Gavrilo Princip. He looked up. He saw the royal car stop just feet away. He stepped forward, he drew his pistol. He fired twice. The first bullet struck Archduchess Sophie in the abdomen. The second pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck, severing his jugular vein. He slumped over, whispering to his wife. They both died within the hour. Princip swallowed a cyanide pill. It was old and only made him vomit. He was seized by the crowd. The two shots were heard around a quiet side street. But they would echo through every capital in Europe. Gavrilo Princip was arrested immediately. He was 19 years old. The gears of empire, however, were far older and much heavier. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph received the news. He saw the killing not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. For years, Serbia had been a thorn in Austria-Hungary's side. Now it could be removed. Austria-Hungary drafted an ultimatum. It was designed to be rejected. The demands were severe. Serbian officials must be fired. Austrian police must operate on Serbian soil. All anti-Austrian propaganda must cease. Serbia was given 48 hours to agree to everything. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II offered Austria-Hungary a blank check. It was a promise of unconditional German support. This was the first domino. It gave Vienna the confidence to be aggressive. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II saw Serbia as a Slavic brother. He promised protection. This was the second domino. Two great power blocs now faced each other. Serbia, surprisingly, agreed to most of the ultimatum. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, a desperate attempt at peace. But Austria-Hungary was not looking for compromise. It declared war on Serbia anyway on July 28, 1914. That was the third domino. Now the system of alliances activated. Russia began to mobilize its army to defend Serbia. Germany viewed Russian mobilization as an act of war. Germany demanded Russia stop. Russia refused. Germany then declared war on Russia on August 1st. The dominoes were falling faster now, and no one knew how to stop them. France, bound by treaty to Russia, prepared to fight. Europe held its breath. The final terrible domino was about to tip. The fatal shots in Sarajevo were now echoing through the chancelleries of Europe. A month of frantic telegrams and ultimatums had failed. The intricate system of alliances designed to keep the peace now began to demand war. In Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, backed by Germany's blank check of support, declared war on Serbia on July 28. Russia, bound by a pledge to protect its Slavic neighbor, ordered the mobilization of its vast army. This was the decisive, irreversible move. In Berlin, German military doctrine was clear and rigid. The Schlieffen Plan was a precise clockwork machine. It required Germany to defeat France in the West within 6 weeks, before turning to face the slower mobilizing Russians in the East. To reach France quickly, German forces needed to pass through neutral Belgium. Germany delivered an ultimatum to Brussels, demanding free passage. Belgium refused, citing its own neutrality guaranteed by treaty. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The following day, German troops crossed into Belgium. That violation of Belgian neutrality triggered the final catastrophic link in the chain. Britain had a long-standing commitment to protect Belgium's neutrality. Reluctantly but decisively, the British cabinet saw no other choice. On August 4, 1914, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. The British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, watched the lamps being lit in London that evening. He remarked that the lights were going out all over Europe, and they would not be lit again in his lifetime. Within a week, a continental dispute had become a world war. The guns of August had begun to fire. The declarations were final. The mobilization orders were given, but what followed was a war no one had truly imagined. This was not a swift campaign of movement. It was a grinding industrial slaughter. By Christmas of 1914, the Western Front had frozen into a line of trenches. It stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Men dug into the earth to survive. The machine gun and massed artillery made old tactics obsolete. Attacks across no man's land became exercises in pure sacrifice. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. The front line moved only a few miles back and forth for years. The scale was unprecedented. Empires called upon their entire populations. Civilians worked in munitions factories. Nations rationed food. For the first time, the sky became a battlefield with warplanes, and the sea depths with submarines. Poison gas drifted across the blasted landscapes of Flanders. The war was global, drawing in colonies from Africa to Asia. The human cost defied comprehension. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, an estimated 20 million people were dead. Millions more were wounded, many with injuries never before seen. The conflict left us scarred by shell craters and a generation scarred by memory. The world that entered the war in 1914, with its emperors and empires, was gone. What would emerge from the mud and ruin was a fractured, traumatized, and entirely new century. The guns fell silent in November of 1918. But the true shape of the peace would be decided in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The treaty signed there in June 1919 was not merely an end to war, but a blueprint for a new world order. Its terms were severe. Germany was stripped of territory, its military gutted. And it was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, the infamous war guilt clause. The reparations demanded were staggering, a financial burden designed to cripple the nation for generations. Maps were redrawn across Europe and the Middle East with a ruler and a pen, not with regard for the people who lived there. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were carved into new, often unstable nations. Borders were drawn, creating ethnic minorities within hostile states, planting seeds of future conflict in places like the Balkans and the Levant. In Germany, the treaty was not seen as peace, but as a diktat, a dictated peace. The humiliation was profound and immediate. The economy collapsed under the weight of reparations, leading to hyperinflation where money became worthless. This bitterness festered. It created a fertile ground for a narrative of betrayal, the myth that the army had been stabbed in the back by politicians. This myth would become a central weapon for extremist voices waiting in the wings. The peace meant to end all war had in ways laid the precise groundwork for the next one. The Treaty of Versailles signed the peace, but it could not sign away the consequences. The war Gavrilo Princip helped start had killed empires and birthed new, fragile nations. It left a map drawn in resentments. Within 2 decades, the terms imposed on Germany, the war guilt clause, the reparations, the military restrictions, would fuel a nationalist fury that made another, even more terrible war almost inevitable. The assassin's bullet did not just start a war, it cracked the foundation of the entire 20th century. The old order of kings and emperors was gone. In its place rose ideologies that promised a new world, built on the ashes of the old. Communism took root in Russia, fascism festered in Italy and Germany. The stage was set for a clash of totalitarian visions, each born from the disillusionment and economic ruin that followed the Great War. The League of Nations, created to prevent another catastrophe, watched powerless. And so the legacy of that summer day in Sarajevo was not a single war, but a chain of them. The Second World War, with its Holocaust and atomic horrors, was a direct descendant. The Cold War, which divided the globe for 50 years, traced its fault lines back to the political earthquakes of 1914–1918. Every major conflict of the modern era, in the Balkans, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, exists on a map that was first redrawn by the victors of a war Princip never intended to cause. He sought to free his people. Instead, he helped a century where millions would lose their freedom and their lives in wars he could never have imagined. The guns fell silent in 1918. The maps were redrawn, but the tremor from Sarajevo never truly stopped. It travels through time, a low-frequency hum beneath our modern world. The system of entangled alliances that Princip's bullet triggered is gone. Yet the pattern remains. A local grievance, a regional power vacuum, a single act of violence that cracks a continent's fragile peace. We see it in the shape of modern borders, drawn at Versailles with little regard for the people who lived within them. We hear it in the language of nationalism that Gavrilo Princip invoked, now echoed in 100 different conflicts. The belief that one violent act can alter history's course did not die with him. It became a grim template. The 20th century was defined by the consequences of that June day, the rise of ideologies, the collapse of empires, a second global war born from the unresolved tensions of the first. The world created by that assassination is the one we still inhabit. Its fault lines are our fault lines, Its lessons written in blood and treaty are the ones we still struggle to learn. So we are left with a quiet, enduring question, as relevant now as it was then. In an interconnected world, can any act of violence ever be truly local? Or does the echo of a single shot, fired on a narrow street, simply travel forever?